I'm telling you, change your ways from me. Believe me, woman, I mean what I say now. Last time I'm telling you, pop that jive. Don't wanna find yourself outside on the playground. What you gonna do? Now that I'm through and die for that.
In the early 60s, a new wave of rhythm and blues arrived in Australia with a Liverpool accent, imported in the cardboard suitcases of British migrants. Pale, skinny kids in tight suits, doing strange tribal dances to a sound born in the Mississippi Delta.
We were the biggest selling act in the country, you know. When the Beatles got to Australia, we had the #1 record. So they were getting mobbed in the streets, so what? So were we.
They called it beat music, black music for white teenagers. It shook up an entire generation, and from its strange mix of cultures, Australians, stars and fans made their own musical identity. But could they ever hope to take on the old country and storm the citadel of British pop? A 250,000 British-born migrants came to Australia in the late 50s and early 60s.
Well, it took a long time, eh? But we're there at last.
Among them were names that would dominate 3 decades of Australian popular music.
Off you go now. Don't you know? Bye, Mummy. Bye-bye.
Easybeats, Billy Thorpe, the AC/DC guys, Glenn Sharrock. You could just about go through and name just about every successful group, and there was a connection through to that British migrant scheme and Adelaide.
Billeted for a while with their families in hostels, they later moved out to brand new suburbs like Elizabeth, built from nothing on a reclaimed salt marsh. Scottish-born Jim Keys was amongst them.
It was built with all the houses, the shops, the churches, the shopping centres, the lot were all built without a person being there, and the factories. And then they just brought shipload after shipload of British migrants out and filled up the whole town.
You would have young kids there arriving with their guitars. Maybe 2 weeks previous they were in Manchester or Liverpool. They knew the songs, they knew half the bands in England. And they were fantastic musos, and everybody in Adelaide, you know, couldn't believe how good these guys were. They were new bands springing up every month.
The new arrivals changed the face of Adelaide's live music scene. It became hip with the styles and sounds of the British wave. For recent arrival Glenn Sharrock, singing was a way to impress Australian girls.
We'd hire a hall. I mean, we even built a really primitive neon sign that flashed on, you know, dance, dance, dance.
Over the course of any week in Adelaide, there were up to 100 city and suburban dancers.
They used to come to the Beat Basement, one of the gigs we played at, and they were there in their motor scooters and duffel coats and scarves, like the real mod look, which wasn't happening anywhere else in Australia.
For their 1964 Australia-wide tour, the Fab Four weren't originally booked to play Adelaide at all. There might have been no Beatlemania here had not thousands of fans signed a petition to the promoter.
They opened their tour in Adelaide. When people asked me where they had their biggest crowds, it was in Adelaide. It was even bigger than Melbourne and Sydney.
When they finally got here, they were greeted by 300,000 fans. A world record. George Harrison said it was like Paris being liberated from the Germans. But it was Adelaide's own rock and rollers who were truly being liberated.
Don't do nothing much, just sit around and look
The Twilights already had a strong local following. They played note-perfect covers of Beatles songs. The impact of the Beatles tour, however, inspired them to write their own tunes.
Now, Julia, behave yourself.
No one ever played original material at all until Lennon McCartney. You know, you could do it yourself. Terry Britton immediately started to write tunes. I had a dabble in those days, but I quickly found out that he was better at it than me and let him do it, and I sang his stuff, you know.
So if you talk about it, don't talk out loud, or she will surely hear and learn the truth somehow, and she will hear about that other girl, and then what will I do if she finds out, if she finds out?
For a while, any successful beat group was tagged the Australian Beatles. But not every band was Beatle mad or wanted a Beatle image.
I wanna be your true loving man, baby. Yeah. 'Cause I wanna do the best I can. Yeah. Believe in me this very day. Oh, every word I gotta say.
The Masters' Apprentices were nothing like the Beatles. The Rolling Stones, maybe. But they dug even deeper for their inspiration, beyond British white teenage sounds to more authentic roots. The young apprentices were about to hit pay dirt.
I was at the drive-in with my girlfriend one night, and in between the two movies, I switched off the drive-in speaker and put on the car radio, and Undecided came on. I couldn't believe it. It was just a shock, you know. There it was. And sure enough, they'd released. We were the last. The band that actually recorded it were the last ones to know that it was released.
It was only an Adelaide demo, but Undecided soared to the top of Australia's national charts.
We looked so radically different from the rest of the bands that were around, and I think that's what attracted people to us. We were the sort of cutting edge.
The notion of what defined a cutting-edge rock and roll band was changing across the country, and migrants were leading the way.
Went to the fortune teller, had my fortune read. Didn't know what to tell her, I had a dizzy feeling in my head.
Sydney had its own well-established club scene.
She said, "Sonny, you feel
Sophisticated, cosmopolitan, sleazy.
Well, here we are in beautiful downtown King's Cross. It's changed a lot since I was a kid, but believe it or not, this is when my career really started. It started just over there in a place called Surf City. Ray Brown and the Whispers started out of there. The Easybeats played there a lot, the Missing Links. Sadly, it's gone. Like so many other things in Australian popular music, they pulled it down.
Long before the Beatles came, Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs had well and truly arrived. They had already turned the home of surf music into a beat joint.
Most people think that the Australian popular music scene that had its beginnings in the early 60s started as a result of the English invasion. It didn't. It had to do with the fact that there was a huge audience here that was looking to something to identify with, and we became it.
You get a kick out of this kind of music?
Yeah?
Why does it appeal to you? What is it about?
Oh, it's young, I suppose, all right.
It's attractive, handsome.
Oh, it's a great singer.
Yeah, what is great about his singing?
Oh, it's just real good, you know?
It's just different than anyone else's.
Yeah, does he do things to you?
Not really.
The Aztecs did write their own material, but were best known for cover versions of imported songs. Even then, the covers they copied were already cover versions.
They were fundamentally important to our fame. Although when I listen to those records today, it sounds like whiter than sliced bread versions of this sort of, you know, funky, black, soul-y Lieber and Stoller tunes. But the way we dealt with them and to the audiences that heard them, it was very different.
Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, this is the group that has out-Beatled the Beatles because they're in #1 position with their song Poison Ivy.
She comes up like a rose, and everybody knows she'll get you indoors. Well, you can love, but you better not. Poison Ivy, poison Ivy. Late at night while you sleep, poison Ivy. She's pretty as a daisy, but look how man she's crazy. She'll really do you in if you let her get under your skin. Poison Ivy, poison Ivy. Late at night while you sleep, poison Ivy comes up.
Melbourne radio stations only played Poison Ivy because they thought the Aztecs came from Liverpool or somewhere. But to the fans, they were real because they were here.
It was a very sort of innocent time, but it was, you know, it was being chased down the street, it was being getting your clothes ripped off, it was fantastic, is how it was.
Billy Thorpe became Australia's biggest homegrown star. Within 18 months, he and the Aztecs had 9 gold records. But their status as Australia's leading group was soon to be challenged. By something original. The songwriting team of Stevie Wright, Harry Vander and George Young would take high-energy Australian rock and roll to the top of the world stage. Their creative example would inspire songwriters all around the country.
I think they realised early that the only way to be different was to come up with something, you know, like with something of your own.
Dutch-born Harry Vander met the others at Sydney's Villawood migrant hostel in 1963.
It wasn't just us at first. There was about 19 guys in the band, you know. Everybody was sort of becoming part of it, and we used to practice in wash houses, and and then one day we heard about this little Scottish guy who was an incredible guitarist. Sitting with some guy in one of those huts, and that's where we first laid eyes on George. And he was sort of going, well, all right, then we'll give it a shot.
George Young had emigrated from Scotland with his brothers Malcolm and Angus.
I suppose it's probably because in the house, you know, there was always a guitar, you know, some in bits, you know, because they had other brothers that sort of used them as weapons.
I really wasn't very up to date with that sort of thing at all. But George was, you know, George was into Little Richard, Chuck Berry, you know, all the real sort of chunky guys.
Stevie Wright's energy and catchy lyrics fused with the band's distinctive guitar sound, and it was not long before they were playing their own songs at Sydney venues like the Balmain Theatre.
Yeah, we'd played a few clubs before then, but that was our first big job, you know. Boy, was we nervous.
We didn't really take a serious interest in music at the start. We just did it for fun, like, you know. And all of a sudden, people started to say, you know, why don't you just become professional? Why don't you just go and play round dances in Sydney?
A young music publisher, Ted Albert, heard the word. there was only one: excitement. It would be the start of a long, successful musical partnership.
He had the feeling that the band was up there with the rest of the world from an international point of view, you know, not just a local little band, but I mean, he felt we had the potential to go all the way.
Ladies and gentlemen, here they are. Snowy! George! Harry! Dick! And last but not least, little Stevie! Who are they?
Like the Aztecs, the Easybeats' popularity soon reached hysterical proportions. But they were the first Australian band to consistently top the charts with their own compositions. Born overseas but nurtured in Australia, the Easybeats had talent to spare. Their rock and roll blitzkrieg captured the country, and everywhere fans realised they now had their own songs, fashions and stars.
I tell my troubles to the cold man. He's a cold man, but he understands. Well, he walks, he talks, he falls on his belly. When I hear a love song, then I know where I belong. Please don't drag it out much longer. Leave before the hurt gets stronger, child. Pretty as a picture. She a mixture. You wanna see the shape she's in? What she ain't got has never been. Carolyn, Carolyn,
17-year-old Johnny Young had become a popular figure in Perth as the lead singer with the Nomads, and as a local TV show host for Club 17. He was one of the early birds to dip into the Easybeats' creative well. Maybe a little too early.
I was a very ambitious young man, and I had my little tape recorder, and I was there at 7 o'clock in the morning. Now, I should have known, being a rock and roller myself, that you don't knock on a rock and roller's door at 7 o'clock in the morning after a gig. But I did, and the door opened, and there were bodies everywhere. Women, naked women, girls, everything. It was just a wild scene.
don't you fool now, play it cool now, step back.
Stevie Wright and George Young reluctantly agreed to write Johnny's first hit, Step Back.
We dragged Stevie out of bed and he went down to the toilet to probably throw up and freshen himself up. And he wrote the words to Step Back. Don't you feel now, play it cool now, step back.
The double A-side single launched Johnny Young as a teen star and was also the first of many pop successes for the Easybeats songwriting team.
Pop fans, slate 6, take 1. Should be roll 2.
Yeah, roll 2.
Not to worry.
Women all around the place. Come and see me.
As they crisscrossed the country, the Easybeats tours generated wild scenes of teenage abandon. Huge shows were organised to cash in on the beat boom.
I came here last night, 9 o'clock, and it's worse. And people just because they scream and all that, they're not mental. The Easybeats.
Yeah, right, fine. Why are you here then?
I want to see the Easybeats. Yeah, they've got real good sound. I think they're fantastic. Oh, I simply adore little Stevie.
Australia's hottest band shared the bill with overseas stars like PJ Proby, Manfred Mann, the Kinks, and even a left field act from New Zealand.
Here we are, Vic. Right. Well, who have you come to see, and tell me why?
Dinah Lee. I think she's absolutely fantastic. She's a goat, not a sheep. She's not one of the crowd. She wears wild clothes, she sings, she moves, she leads the people.
As well as turning heads with her raunchy stage act, Dinah Lee too had a rebellious edge, which teenage girls identified with.
Mothers hated me. They hated me because they go, "Don't you get that Dinah Lee haircut?"
She brought with her the classic 60s mod look from, of all places, Christchurch.
Dinah appeared on a television show wearing Bermuda shorts. And believe you me, this caused quite a rumpus.
Why? Did it create such a stir?
Did it what? The phone didn't stop ringing in my office for days.
I was lucky. I just had this image that created something a bit more powerful. When I did sing, I didn't sing cute and pretty. It was like a belting. I belted out songs.
Boy, now there's a girl that knows what to do with a song. I think she's one of the big talents in this country. Speaking of talent, Stevie, for the past 6 months, we've seen frantic scenes all around Australia, at airport receptions for you, the tours that you've been in. It would be fair to say, I think, that you've caught on like sliced bread in this country.
The scene had reached critical mass hysteria. The obvious next step for the Easybeats was to see if the big world out there would succumb. In 1966, they left for London.
After we'd gone through the whole screaming sort of hysteria bit, we were doing the rounds of the capital cities, and then we do a country thing and all that. And then after doing that about 4, 5, 6 times, you know, you think, well, how much longer can you do this before everybody's going to be bored shitless? So we thought, well, hang on, you know, it's a big world out there.
Our first record will probably be one called Sorry, which we think's very original, you know.
And are you going to change your style much, or go along much the same path that you've chosen with your style of music in the pop world?
No, it will be an Australian sound. We'll definitely try to get our own sound, not a Beatles sound or a Rolling Stone sound.
So you're going to be entirely original, and you're going to be an Australian group, and the Easybeats, as we've known you right throughout the country. Well, I think right now we'll have a listen, a preview of perhaps the first pop record that will be released on the flip side of the world, Britain, for the Easybeats, the song called Sorry. Could you roll the tape, please?
The single Sorry was a turning point for Australian rock. A harder edge in the rhythm guitar, and one of the heaviest lead solos captured on vinyl. This raw, stripped-back R&B would soon run through the veins of Australian rock and roll. While bands like the Easybeats were heading overseas, others were looking closer to home to develop their sound.
Melbourne was the hub of music in Australia, obviously, at the time. It was just the place to be. And bands were attracted here like a big magnet from everywhere. Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, Sydney. Bands flocked here from all over Australia to Melbourne to to soak up the atmosphere. The gigs were all here, of course.
Melbourne already had a rich history of music, including jazz, folk and early 50s rock and roll. But the 60s brought with it a new volatile mix of youth tribes that took to the streets.
They look at you once, you ignore them. They look at you twice, you ask them what they want. They look at you a third time, you block them.
What do they use to fight with?
Oh, steel bars, pike chains and bricks.
And what usually happens after you block them?
They start falling, most of them.
I do believe that your environment does help fashion what you are. Melbourne had the balls. You went to Melbourne and it just put balls on the band.
Brisbane blues guitarist Lobby Lloyd was one of the many beat, pop and blues musicians drawn into Melbourne's intensity.
Because it was 6 o'clock closing, there were gigs everywhere in Melbourne. Every Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday night.
To see the new bands of the 60s, fans of all ages filled hundreds of unlicensed venues where they could do their own thing.
Dirty, dark little rooms and crowds, loud music. Very creative, very expressive places. Once it fires up, everybody sort of connects. The audience connects, the band connects, the whole thing happens. This is the heart and soul of music.
All the bands used to cross like ships in the night. You'd start out early at, say, Ringwood Town Hall, and you'd be on the ice cream spot like 7 o'clock at night or something.
Start off at the Thumping Tom at like 8 o'clock at night. You'd do half an hour there, you'd throw all the gear in the Thames van.
Race like hell the other side of town at the Village Green Hotel or somewhere. You do the middle spot.
Then jump in the van again and head down to Frankston to one of the dances there and do like a midnight spot.
Finish up late at night at Birdie's or the Tum or somewhere and play till 3 a.m.
And for that, you'd probably earn £5 a show.
And all the time, there's all these bands, hi boys, hey, see you, whatever. It was fantastic. There really was a feeling of mateship and camaraderie.
Baby, won't you please come home? Whoa, baby, baby, won't you please come home? Well, I ain't been myself, baby, ever since you've been gone.
Clubs and discos like Bertie's, Sebastian's, Opus and Biting Eye energised inner-city Melbourne on Friday and Saturday nights as musicians now began to explore the roots of that Easybeats sound. But the belly of the beat-mad beast, the place everyone wanted to be, was the Thumping Tom. Hot, sweaty and electric. Anything could happen.
On certain nights when they got excited, I'd shut the door and we'd lock it and people would start taking their clothes off and have a damn good time. But no, it didn't happen every night. Damn it.
I think the excitement was really based around the music because it was all new.
The people that went to a place like the Thumping Tom were quite diverse. So the music that sort of settled into position there initially, I think, were the blues and soul music.
I think at one stage we were actually in Australia, particularly in this city here, playing an internationally acceptable but unusual kind of rock and roll that was quite unique. The industry didn't see it, but the people out there saw it because they were going out in droves. Everywhere everywhere you went, the joints were full, they were jumping.
What had started out as British R&B now had an Australian life and sound of its own. But it was growing without much help from the local media.
Now from AWA, like wild, like very new from AWA. The Carnaby Group, wildest new transistors ever from AWA. Wow!
Even if it was now transistorised, radio was still mining the novelty pop vein.
But I think radio's gas, absolutely gas. It should be banned. Commercial ones.
I like something a little bit of beat and a bit of melody.
But then this pop music is the trend these days. The young ones like it.
All the shows, football races, all the pop numbers. Lives on the air, I like.
A scintillating survey of selling sounds.
Radio was still the dominant influence in making stars in Melbourne, and 50s DJ Stan Rofe still knew how to use it to plug the new young talent.
We couldn't put him on, and he would have been. You can't put a kid on stage and say he's 13. So we had to say he's 15, and he looked every part of it. And but he stole the show, this little devil.
Necessarily so. It ain't necessarily so. The things that you're liable to read in the Bible ain't necessarily so.
Normie Rowe had the right poppy image. All he needed was a song that would attract radio's attention.
I pinched a record I got from the UK that no one knew they had. It was called It Ain't Necessarily So, sort of a slower, rockish blues, sort of almost like blues.
The industry was happy to exploit rock's rebellious instincts, suitably modified. The lyrics of It Ain't Necessarily So, coming from the mouth of a pop singer, sounded like sacrilege, a minor sensation that made Normie a star.
I didn't realise it was blasphemous until somebody told me that 2SM had banned it, and 2SM was To Santa Maria, you know. And I said, oh God, what do we do now? And then all of a sudden it's a smash, you know.
I got the reaction I want. Just about every church leader in town said, Normie Rowe is Devil's Disciple, and Sam the Man is even worse. But the record went up there to #1.
They seek him here, they seek him there. His clothes are loud, but never square. It will make or break him, so he's got to buy the best, 'cause he's a dedicated follower of fashion.
In London, pop was also in the ascendancy, and the competition was intense. The Easybeats were struggling.
We thought we better go out and have a look at the competition. You know, we were pretty cocky at the time, right? Because don't forget, we were coming off this huge sort of adulation trip, you know. I mean, and this band came on, and they proceeded to blow us away. You know, it's like, I mean, these guys were suave, professional, sounded great, played great. I mean,
why would anyone pay attention to an Australian band playing beat music? They had to record a song that no one could ignore. They teamed up with Shel Talmy, producer of The Kinks and The Who. He was their catalyst.
He must have gone through about 100 ideas that we had, you know, and it's like, shit. It was like, rubbish, you know. And he came up with, he says, well, here's 5, and work on them. And we did, and one of them was Friday on My Mind. We actually got stuck on that song. There was a devil of a part to get to the chorus, because there was a sort of key change problem there, you see. But we finally, you know, like it fell into place, and we played it to Shel, and he said, that's the one. Didn't even, you know, he just born out creative process, you know, where you know, like where the skies would open and all these revelations would come. And that was it. One take.
Their working-class anthem reached #6 in Britain in November 1966 and went into the US top 20 in May the following year. Australia's Easybeats were international stars with their own song.
Well, it's the Beatles this year.
The hip word at home was go.
Go, go for fabulous. Hey, this is Lonnie on the live wire line between UZ and your place. We're at Torquay and happily...
Go records, go clubs, go-go dancers, and Go Set, Australia's first ever rock magazine.
Oh, hello. I'm Doug Panther, Go Set's drunken reporter.
The name Go Set was pure 60s. From go-go and jet set, it was from and for a generation that invented youth culture for itself, took it more seriously than commercial radio stations, and eagerly promoted local and underground live music.
It just grew and grew, and at one stage I think its distribution was like 110,000 per week. I mean, that was extraordinary for back then, for that time, for that sort of paper, or for any sort of paper.
Ready, steady, go!
Hi, and welcome to The Go Show.
TV also went go with The Go Show, fronted by pop stars Johnny Young and Ian Thorpe.
Oh, it was huge, mate. I mean, the audience was predominantly teeny bopperish. We took over more from 6 o'clock rock than, say, Bandstand did. You know what I mean? Bandstand was nice. And ours was more your grungy, basic rock. With such a hunger for content, Australian rock and roll television was open to almost anything. The result being a sometimes bizarre mix of underground and mainstream music. Rock and roll's itinerant minstrels now had their chance to compete with pop royalty and reach a wider audience.
Good on you, King. There's a big king for you.
The pop industry thought it had taken everything it needed from the beat revolution. But there was more, from unexpected sources. Melbourne's jazz venues. In there with the self-conscious bohemian students was something totally new. A really underground sound that would for the first time go to the top of the mainstream pop charts.
Everything we did was wrong. We found it home, baby, please be gone. Dreams are easy, but baby, understand. It's so very hard for you to leave your ever-loving man. Forget everything, oh, everything you meant to me, baby. My world is easy, oh, but leave your misery. My world is ended, oh, but baby, understand. It's so very hard for you to leave your ever-loving man. I don't need your loving. I don't want your loving. I won't have your loving. Oh, baby, no more.
The loved ones reconstructed themselves from, of all things, a trad jazz band, the Red Onions. With its quirky rhythms and charismatic lead singer Jerry Humphreys, the loved ones soon gained a serious cult status.
It was not a feel band, it was an intellectual, it was a head band, because you'd lose the beat. And that was the reason we started being original, because we really could not play other people's music. We were not good at it.
Remember this one? It's The Loved Ones. And it's called The Loved Ones. You're hearing it on 3AK.
The band's hybrid of jazz and blues made their song The Loved One a timeless classic.
I'd been knocking around with these chord progressions, which was, if you actually go into what they are, it's a sort of 9/4 time, but I wasn't thinking of it that way. I just sort of sounded interesting to me. And Ian, who's a very good muso, sort of picked up on it, and so we had the second part with the contrasting chord pattern, and Jerry came up with the chorus line, which is actually what sort of made it work.
Yonder she's walking, she comes my way. Red dress on, long black hair, talking like, walking like, wanting like, she comes to me. Oh baby, I love you so, I need you now, I want you back, I can't go on. Hell, just baby, you child, I've known you well, if you want to stay, that's alright.
Sadly, the loved ones only made one LP. Their revolutionary sound was never heard in the wider world, but their success proved there was an audience for underground rhythm and blues. The Australian scene was developing real roots, but many still couldn't help themselves, looking to London. The Easybeats were like the advance guard for those in search of a wider audience, up-to-date recording technology, and the real money. A procession of aspiring Australian talent headed for London. Not all the aspirants understood that the opportunities that launched the lads from Liverpool would not necessarily be offered to bands of unknowns from the more distant colonies.
Friends of ours, John Broom and the Handles, had gone to England to try and further their careers. The first band I ever knew that decided to go to England. Imagine, I mean, there's a group from Adelaide arriving in London, you know, swinging London, Carnaby Street, Beatles, Stones, Yardbirds. John Broom and the Handles. Poor buggers didn't stand a chance.
For bands without the cash for their own overseas ticket, there was no chance at all. Until a local sweets manufacturer, Hoadley's, makers of Violet Crumble bars, started a national Battle of the Sounds competition in 1966.
Such a corny thing now, but it was tremendously important. It was a way for unknowns to be shot to prominence, basically almost overnight.
Predictably, the makers of Violet Crumble had a taste for the sweeter sounds. The first winners were the Twilights. First prize was a trip to London by boat.
They used to go up and down like a bloody roller coaster. It was nothing to be thrown off your feet. You know, we just do it there at the back of the boat. The Veranda Lounge, it was called.
Like trying to find a needle in a haystack. What I say, a needle in a haystack. Yeah, yeah, she do, what she do.
It would take months of struggle in London before the Twilights finally got to record at EMI's famous Abbey Road studio, the home of their heroes.
We checked into Abbey Road on the 4th of January and a light snow was falling. It was very romantic. And the concierge, you know, the typical look, you know, he looks like a railway porter. Hello, lads. You know, you're going to do your bit tonight? Yeah, he said, well, you picked a bloody good night tonight, you know, the group's in. We couldn't really concentrate. We had the door open all the time, you know, waiting to see them or glimpse them or something. And sure enough, George Harrison wafts in, you know, looking like some sort of Merlin. Just walked straight past, didn't even look in, you know. We all sort of ran to the door and had a look.
Their close encounter with the living legends in the sanctum of Abbey Road failed to translate into sales magic. The Twilights returned home with sitars, paisley shirts, and a higher state of awareness. They'd be better off doing the Beatles thing in Australia. As it turned out, Britain wanted something totally different from Australia.
Well, I'm gonna put on my long white robe down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna put on my long white robe down by the riverside. I ain't gonna study war no more.
It came from a group from Melbourne, with its roots not in underground rock, but wholesome, hearty folk. The Seekers set out on their trip of a lifetime playing their own way on a P&O cruise ship. They had no idea what they were in for.
We arrived
there for the sound check, and there's a chalkboard out the front that said, "Tonight, the Seekers by Pubic Demand." They get rid of the bingo call, and we're waiting behind the curtains, I think.
Yeah.
And this fella comes on in front of the curtains and says, "It has come to my attention, certain of our members have been seen relieving themselves against the west wall of this club. It's bloody disgusting and has got to stop, ladies and gentlemen, the Seekers."
When first we left old England's shore, such yarns as we were told.
Regular bookings did come on variety shows, and then the classic lucky break.
Turn it up a bit. And I'll be there
Well,
someday.
sounds good, I like it. Yeah, not bad. Morning, can I speak to Judith Doran?
Take it home over the weekend.
Oh, well, Judith, Athol, I want you to hear a song that's been written for us by Tom Springfield. Okay?
Folk singer Dusty Springfield caught their act and mentioned it to her brother, songwriter Tom.
He had a very good feel for what the group should do because our music was coming in completely from left of field. Very simple song with a melody and acoustic instruments. You know, we were very innocent in our approach.
There is always someone for each of us, they say, and you'll be my someone forever and a day. I could search the whole world over until my life is through, but I know I'll never find another you. It's a long, long journey, so stay by my side.
With I'll Never Find Another You, the Seekers had a song and a writer that matched their wholesome image.
The dawn is waking, and my tears are falling rain, for the carnival is over.
It was perfect for the taste of the all-powerful medium of British television.
We, as a group, were a product of our environment in Australia. When we arrived, we dressed in a certain way. We were just ourselves. And in comparison to English rhythm and blues bands like the Yardbirds, of course, we were radical. But I think that's what set us apart.
We were losing our way something dreadfully, you know. Here was this sort of once vibrant sort of rocky band, you know. All of a sudden we were writing things that Engelbert Humperdinck could have sung.
They came home like all conquering heroes in 1967. But in Britain, Harry Vander and George Young would have to wait 10 years before they could repeat the success of Friday on My Mind.
We'll build a world of our own that no one else can share. All our sorrows will leave far behind us there.
Unlike the Easybeats, the BBC was infatuated by the Seekers. In living rooms right across Britain, feet were tapping. They had their own TV show, a string of sing-along hit tunes and a Royal Command performance. They were outselling the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
It really was a turning point for Australia generally. We were actually headlines of the main tabloids of Fleet Street,
Yeah.
Australian group, hits #1, you know.
Yes.
So all of a sudden we were seen as ambassadors for Australia and being introduced to, you know, prime ministers and things. From then on, it was a whole different ballgame. And in fact, we've met people who emigrated to Australia because they'd seen us. They've come and talked to us and really, you know.
Despite the efforts of many British-born migrants to make a mark on their country of birth, it was a band of unknown Australians that had conquered the capital of pop's empire. In March 1967, Seekermania arrived in Australia, sealed with Britain's stamp of approval. 200,000 people came to see the Seekers sing their international hit Georgie Girl at the Myer Music Bowl, the largest crowd ever for a pop concert in the Southern Hemisphere.
You can always run away. Don't
Was this the end for Australian rock? A new generation of musicians would take that hard-edged Easybeats guitar sound somewhere else. From Melbourne, up the road to Sunbury. The British may have missed it, but Australia got it. The foundations were set.
I started very young. I started at the age of 10 professionally. I discovered, and that was in the late 50s, I discovered in the late 60s that the secret was to reinvent yourself, and it was a subconscious thing. It wasn't something I was going, well, who am I going to be next week and what music am I going to get to? But the course that my life took, and the types of music I was introduced to and the kinds of players that I met from overseas and whatever, kind of took me in that way. And in retrospect, I realise now that that in fact was what I was doing from Brisbane, where I started, and then I came to Sydney in the early 60s. That was a complete change. And then the change that took place in me musically from the early 60s with the original Aztecs and the Poison Ivy era, through to meeting the R&R guys in the late 60s, and then getting into the heavier music that led into a real change of image and a change of style. O'Keeffe was really my idol. I'd seen, as a result of being on television and being a local personality in Brisbane, I was a novelty act. I was playing a guitar that was sort of up to there, you know, on TV. And but I got to play like Cloudland. I got to play at all the different Brisbane venues and all the clubs. There was a wonderful gig right in the heart of Brisbane, just near the town hall. It's gone now, called Birdland upstairs. And I mean, people like, not just Johnny O'Keefe and Cole Joy, but Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Gene Vincent, all of these people were coming and playing the Hamilton tennis courts, and I got to be around all those people. I got to be on shows with some of those people. I got to see the best at their prime. I mean, I really, although I was only this big, it got into my blood. And, you know, I made my, I had my tastes and at that stage, and I loved O'Keefe. He certainly wasn't one of the great singers, but in terms of looking at all the people that I saw, he impressed me more than anybody. In particular, I went to see him at the Festival Hall, and I must have been about 11 or 12 years old. My mother took me, because my mother took me everywhere. She'd take me to a gig, I'd play a gig, and she'd take me home in a cab. And he lost his voice, and he got up on stage and tried to sing and couldn't, and the place was packed, about 7,000 people. And he took a chair and sat on a chair and talked to the crowd, of a sold-out crowd, for about 2 hours. And I can remember, even at that age, thinking, now that is a star. That I can just remember, I can see it in my mind's eye. I thought, that's what I want to be able to do. I want to be that relaxed. I want to be that professional. That just, I want to be able to entertain, you know. And so I modelled myself on O'Keefe. I stole everything, all of my early stuff from O'Keefe, and I absolutely have no bones about admitting it, you know. He knew it. I got to play on shows with him. I mean, I eventually took over his television show, you know, but I idolised him. I didn't want to be Elvis, I wanted to be O'Keefe. Well, the first band after I arrived in Sydney lasted just 18 months. And in that time, you know, we created something that's lasted 35 years in terms of its reputation. When that band ended up not coming back together, Tony and Vince Maloney, who were two of the guitar players, went out on their own and got a record deal. They were called Vince and Tony's 2, which is one of the most god-awful names anybody could ever come up with. And it crashed and burnt. And I ended up stealing 2 guys from Ray Hoff's Offbeats and 2 guys from Max Merritt's Meteors, who had come out from New Zealand, because Max Merritt and the Meteors had come out and were playing here in Surf City. And put together a second Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs in 1965, and off we went again with a string of hits. That band stayed together through until 1968. I had my own television show in 1966-67 called It's All Happening, which was live to air nationally, 6:30 out of Channel 7. People like Dionne Warwick and came out to do the show. And I did farewells for the Easybeats and the Bee Gees and specials and things like that. At the same time, R&R had hit. All of the American servicemen were coming into Sydney, pouring into Sydney, tens of thousands a week. The Whiskey A Go-Go opened down on William Street, which was also co-owned by John Harrigan, who had owned Surf City, and John was still managing me. So I got to start playing. Although I was doing television, I still needed to play live just to keep my hand in. So I started playing odd nights at the Whiskey A Go-Go and started to really dig what was going on there, this interaction with these strange servicemen from the States, guys from Alabama and from Louisiana and from Chicago, and, people I'd not really met before. I mean, I'd only known a couple of black guys up until then, and, people from guys from Hawaii. The television show ended, and because Channel 7 in Melbourne wanted to start their own television show, wouldn't take it, so the second biggest market in the country didn't want the show, so I ended up losing a top-rating TV show, which was sad. However, it got me into playing, and I started playing 1-2 nights a week at the Whiskey, and then ended up playing around the clock, 4 or 5 sets a night, 5 nights a week at the Whiskey, to these R&R servicemen.
Yes, I mean, I always wanted to be an international singer myself, but it wasn't when I set out with the group. We all really went on a holiday. We went to England for a 10-week turnaround trip on a boat, and we didn't really think, oh, well, we're going to set the world alight and try and crack the pop charts. In fact, the pop charts was probably the furthest thing from any of our minds, including my own, because you just didn't try to do that with a folk-based quartet. Everybody was more poppy and had the long hair, and the electric instruments were coming in. So really that was the big surprise to us and the world, the fact that suddenly our record had gone to #1, and it opened the way then for a lot of Australian artists to actually go overseas and literally set off with a purpose to try and conquer the pop market.
We were also fortunate enough to become involved in a regular television national program called The Ronnie Carroll Show. Now that was a big program of its time, and even then I think they probably would have had viewing audiences well over 10 million, wouldn't they, at the time? So people got used to seeing us every week over that 13-week period, and we believe that it was television that actually broke the group over there, because when the first records eventually came out, people knew us. They knew our faces and the style of music.
When I'll Never Find Another You reached #1, we were just ecstatic. It took everyone by surprise.
Yes, I remember we were celebrated in a bar in Regent Street called Verries, which was near our agent's office, and I remember someone bringing the chart out and showing us. It was quite a monumental achievement when we think about it now, because this was the first Australian group to ever do this.
Georgie Girl actually reached #1 on the American charts. It was the first time an Australian group had ever really cracked it. And that was a big turning point for us here in Australia, because suddenly Sydney saw us not just as a Melbourne group, but truly as an international Australian group, But we didn't really get over there much. We did the Ed Sullivan Show. We did a couple of those afternoon shows, and we toured once.
One in Philadelphia,
yes, Mike Douglas Show.
Mike Douglas Show.
But I mean, we really should have been touring constantly from the moment Georgie Girl hit, because after all, it had been nominated for an Oscar. We didn't get there for the Oscars, so we really missed out on major exposure that way. And it was only about 6-8 months after we'd had New Georgie Girl #1 that we finally got over there to tour, a college tour. But it still wasn't really reaching the public the way it should have done to sort of perpetuate the group in front of the public like that.
After the initial success of Another You, Tom was under pressure to come up with more songs, and he did. A World of Our Own, when we heard that, was more instantly recognisable to us as a style, I think, after the first song. But prior to that, we had no preconceived ideas about what that style would be. And then really that cemented it. But the interesting one was, out of left field, was The Carnival Is Over, which certainly wasn't in any way poppy. It was a true ballad and very distinctive sound. and probably the most successful selling single in England. In fact, we remember, don't we, that it sold in one day 90,000 units of a single. I mean, that would have to be still close to a record there today.